Okay, it looks like there are quite a few of us here, so I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, first of all, for joining our webinar, Forward with Dementia, Promoting Hope Through Culturally Specific Dementia Resources, hosted by Dr. Carrie McAiney and Navjot Gill. My name is Emma Bender. I'm the project manager of the Forward with Dementia initiative, which is hosted here at the Schlegel-UW Research Institute for Aging, or the RIA, as we like to call it. So I'm going to start off our webinar by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The RIA is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that include 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. There are a few items that I just like to cover briefly before we get into today's webinar. So firstly, as you were probably notified when you logged on, this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available in both English and French. If you would like to listen to the webinar in French today, simultaneous interpretation is available. So if you would like to, just click the interpretation button, which is in the meeting control panel at the bottom of your screen. You can see on the screen there, we've included a screenshot of what that looks like. And then you can select your preferred language from there, either English or French. There will be a question and answer period at the end of the webinar today. Dana, who is online, you want to give a wave. She's monitoring the chat and the question boxes. So you can access those again in the meeting control panel at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to use those anytime throughout today's webinar. I see some people have already jumped in the chat to say good morning. So I'll just start by telling you a little bit about the RIA. So if you aren't familiar with the RIA, we are a charitable nonprofit foundation. Our mission is to enhance care and quality of life for older adults through partnerships in research, education, and practice. The RIA supports research and explores aging across various topics, including dementia, technology, culture change, nutrition, heart health, and spirituality. We engage with partners throughout the research process and use research findings to co-design resources, programs, education, and training, like the resources that we're going to talk about today. Ultimately, we inform practice and policy change to enhance quality of life for older adults everywhere. So that's a bit about us. Before I turn it over to Carrie to introduce Forward with Dementia, I also want to tell you a little bit about our speakers. There we go. So Dr. Carrie McAiney is an associate professor in the School of Public Health Sciences at the University of Waterloo. And she is also Schlegel Research Chair in Dementia and Scientific Director of the Murray Alzheimer's Research and Education Program here at the RIA. She also leads the Forward with Dementia project in Canada. Carrie's research involves working in partnership with persons living with dementia, family care partners, providers, and organizations to co-design and evaluate interventions that enhance well-being among persons living with dementia and care partners. We also have Navjot Gill joining us today. She's a Ph.D. candidate in public health at the University of Waterloo, specializing in aging health and well-being. Her research is focused on exploring the experiences of South Asian Canadians living with dementia and their care partners. Alongside her professional work, she is also a care partner to her grandmother who's living with dementia. She also advocates for culturally inclusive dementia care. Navjot is also a member of Forward with Dementia's co-design team for the South Asian community, which you will hear more about in today's webinar. Okay, and with that, I will turn it over to Carrie to start us off.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emma. And thank you to everyone for being here today. I'm thrilled to be here, and particularly thrilled to be here with Navjot because she has just wonderful experience and insight and has taught us a lot as we've been going along this process. So it's wonderful to be able to be with her and to have all of you here to learn a little bit about the resources and the work that we've been doing over the past year. So I'm going to just start by talking a little bit about Forward with Dementia. And so this initiative really started as part of an international research project involving 5 different countries. And the first part of the project really focused on developing this website, and it's called Forward with Dementia. And on the screen, you'll see the Canadian version of the website. And so in developing this resource, we worked together with people living with dementia, family care partners, and health and social care providers to develop website content, stories, and resources that focused on giving people a sense of hope. And the hope that we're talking about is that hope that people can live and live well, or as well as possible with dementia. Next slide. We were then fortunate enough to get some additional funding from the Public Health Agency of Canada to undertake a second phase of the project. And in the second phase, our goal was to co-design resources to be culturally and linguistically specific to 3 communities within Canada: the Chinese community, the South Asian community, and the Italian community. Next, yeah. So why would this be needed? Why is this something that we wanted to undertake? Next slide. So people living with dementia and family care partners or caregivers have a right to have information that aligns with their culture. We know, however, that there is a huge gap in our understanding of dementia among these communities. We have very limited research, I think, generally and particularly in Canada, to understand what the experiences of individuals are like, what their needs are, and how best to support them, and including other types of interventions that might be able to assist them in living well with dementia. There's also a significant gap in resources that are available that are more specific to cultural communities. You can find some resources that have been often translated. So there's an English version, then it's translated into different languages, and that's a wonderful first step. But that's missing the adaptation or the cultural specific aspect. And we wanted to start to address this. It's a huge gap, so it's a big job. But so we're taking little tiny steps at this point to try and address that gap. Because we know that, if we've got information that's not culturally specific, then it's probably less likely to be used, which will then contribute to uh, that lack of awareness and continued misunderstanding, as well as stigma when it comes to dementia. So now I'm going to turn it over to Navjot to talk a little bit about her experiences.
Thank you so much, Carrie. So I'll be touching upon how dementia is perceived within the South Asian community, as well as sharing my personal experience with my grandma. So when looking at perceptions of dementia within South Asian community, as Carrie mentioned, we have very little research coming out of Canada. And with the research that we have out of the UK, it shows that more often than not, there's a specific, like a large lack of awareness of what dementia is within the South Asian community. So there is no direct translation for dementia, the word as such, in many South Asian languages, as well as there is this normalization of dementia just because of the lack of awareness, where people often see it as a normal part of aging and something that happened even within my family. So when my grandmother was diagnosed, she was diagnosed relatively early. So at that point, her main symptoms were that she was just forgetting names here and there. So my family initially is like, she's getting old. That's okay. It's normal that she's forgetting things. There are also religious connotations to dementia. So there's the concept of karma, that if somebody has dementia and they're exhibiting certain symptoms, they're paying for sins from their past life. Or there's even a belief that, you know, certain pieces such as the hallucinations, that they're developing a deeper connection with God. Or specifically, an example is in the Bangla culture, dementia is seen as a suffering. So if you suffer in this lifetime, you attain heaven once you pass. So there are certain ways of how dementia is seen and normalized, which is due to the lack of awareness. But this lack of awareness then adds into the stigma. So because of the way it's perceived, sometimes as even a mental health issue, and mental health is not openly discussed within the community. So people are reluctant in acknowledging and discuss dementia openly. Next slide, please. So the challenges that arise due to stigma are there's delayed diagnosis and limited access to support services. So one of the few studies out of Canada, a 2012 study showed that on average in South Asian Canadians, there was a 4-year delay from the onset of symptoms to the diagnosis, which is relatively a large period of time, because the sooner you're able to get or receive that diagnosis, then you can plan accordingly and ensure the well-being of the person. And then there's the isolation due to the fear of societal judgment, which hinders medical attention and community assistance. Like even example within the South Asian community, it's a very communal aspect where everybody kind of knows everybody, and there's a strong belief on how you're perceived by the outside community, like within your own community. So people often don't want to mention dementia or potentially have somebody think, oh, there's somebody who's quote unquote mad in their family, because that's how dementia is seen. But it's very important to have that awareness, because dementia is not a normal part of aging. And yes, there might be religious beliefs associated with it, but it is a physical condition which progresses over time, and the symptoms progress over time. And so that is something that needs to be treated with the same value that we give to, you know, other conditions such as cancer and other physical conditions that happen to a person. And then that's why these resources are so important, because even when my grandmother was diagnosed, we struggled with finding resources which were appropriate. My parents struggled with the language barrier. And I remember when I was trying to find resources for them, more often than not, there was such lack of representation. They would see people who did not look like them, and it just added to that notion with them that this is a disease or a condition that does not happen in our community. This is something that happens in the Western countries, right? So it's not a us problem. And that's why these resources are very crucial, where, you know, the adaptation is done in a way where you see yourself represented. It's linguistically and culturally appropriate. Next slide, please. And yeah, and then this is where these resources really are needed, because we need to address this lack of awareness. There's this vicious cycle that starts because there's lack of awareness. We don't really understand what dementia is. There are myths that come out of it, such as the normalization, which adds to the stigma. And because we don't want to talk about it, it further perpetuates the lack of awareness, and it just keeps on going. So when these resources are available where people can relate to them, understand them in their own language, see people who look like them, and kind of know that fights that stigma that this can happen to anyone and we should be open to talking about it. This is where these resources come in and really support the communities. So we talked about this gap, about the lack of awareness and the stigma piece. So what would be the steps to address this gap? So I did touch upon how these resources, such as the one we're discussing today, are needed. So they need to be culturally and linguistically relevant. So linguistically, so if you if you're not able to speak or understand English, it becomes a barrier for you to, you know, read certain resources and not able to connect with them. The cultural piece is, again, the representation piece, and having an understanding of how this connects with you. Certain things that could be in a English resource, you may not necessarily connect with them because that's not a culturally appropriate representation to you. And then Carrie touched upon the adaptation versus translation piece. And these resources, if they're adapted, they're much more helpful, because even during our, I remember during our co-design meeting, there were such small things, right? It's like, go out for exercise, lift weight. But in our, at least in the South Asian community, lifting weight is not something we often talk about when we look at exercise, especially for women. So it was like, let's say go for a walk or certain things. So having those small pieces that may not look bigger on the outside, but those things really help you connect and then follow through with those resources. And that's where that adaptation piece comes in. Next slide, please. And I will hand it back to Carrie.
Thanks, Navjot. Yeah, great segue here. So Navjot really talked about this gap in greater detail and why we need to start to address the gap. And so for this part of the Forward with Dementia project, again, our goal was to co-design or co-adapt resources to make them more culturally and linguistically specific to the three communities that we were focused on. So the first step was to pull together co-design teams. So we had three co-design teams, one for the Chinese community, one for the Italian community, and one for the South Asian community. Now, ideally, we like to have both people living with dementia and family members to be part of the work that we do. Unfortunately, we really struggle to identify individuals living with dementia who were willing to be part of our group. And our groups, I should say. And we heard from family members that stigma was playing a big part of that. So the stigma in some of the communities that we were targeting was probably higher than it is generally. And we know that stigma is an issue, across Canada in all communities. And so, unfortunately, we weren't able to identify any individuals living with dementia to be part of our co-design teams. However, we were able to identify many amazing, wonderful family members to be part of our co-design teams. And so they have worked with us over the past year. And I think I'd mentioned previously, this work would not have been possible without them. We really were learning together, and the insights that they provided were just so important and so meaningful, and have really helped to make these resources, we believe, to be excellent resources and ones that we are really hoping that the communities will be using. So we worked together to identify information from the Forward with Dementia website that was important, the things we wanted to highlight, and then we would have monthly meetings to discuss each of the resources. And as Navjot pointed out, it was identifying these little things that needed to be or would be helpful to incorporate into those resources to make them more culturally specific. And I'll give some examples in another slide or two. So we've been going through this process and developing the resources, and now have several that are up available on the Forward with Dementia website. And we're doing some evaluation work just to get some feedback on those resources as we go along with this project. This is also a new area for us at the RIA and for myself as a researcher as well, to be working with different cultural communities. And so we want to learn from that process. And so that will also be part of our evaluation, so we can understand what has worked well and where we might need to make some improvements, because we want to continue to do work in this area. Next slide. Okay. So we've given you a little bit of background on, how we've come to this point, why we've focused on this particular aspect of developing resources. And so now we want to just share some information about, how you can find the resources, how you can use the resources yourselves, and/or share them with others. And then we'll talk a little bit about how these resources are intended to complement other information that's out there. So when you log on to the Forward with Dementia website, this is what the page will look like. And I know it's really small on your screens, and that's okay. We'll go to the next slide. We've just honed in a little bit. So you'll see there are 6 pictures, and sometimes we call these tiles. The top 3 were already part of the website. And so you could click on those, any of those tiles to get information for people living with dementia, for caregivers, and for health and social care providers. The 3 pictures or tiles underneath are the new ones that we've added. And so this is how you would access information for the Chinese community, for the Italian community, and for the South Asian community. So if we, for example, go to the next slide, if we clicked on the tile for the Chinese community, this is what would come up. And so we start by providing a little bit of information and background on what these resources are, and make some comments about terminology, because terminology is, as Navjot had mentioned earlier, it can be challenging. There's not often direct translations. And so then we have the various resources listed underneath. And as mentioned, there are more coming. So we are still in the process of doing some translations and some reviews. And so those will be coming up over the next a couple of weeks. So please check them out. Next slide. So this is an example of one of the resources that we have on the site. And so this is called What is Dementia? And so there is a version of this available for each community. So here we've got the Chinese community, but there's also one for the Italian and for the South Asian community. And much of the information included in those resources is the same across the 3 communities. So the basic information about dementia is the same. But as Navjot was getting at, the adaptations is what is unique to the resources for each community. So we might include information about, for example, how is dementia thought about or perceived in that community? What do they think about the responsibility of family members to care for people living with dementia? There also might be things, as Navjot pointed out, in terms of activities or the interests or the practices of the communities that are incorporated. And so while the basic information is very similar across, we've incorporated these cultural aspects to make them more relevant. And then, as Navjot pointed out, something that people can connect with. I think we can all, think of times when we're looking at something, and if we have that connection, we're more likely to read it or continue to read it, and then hopefully to put things into practice. So this is what we mean about adapting and not just translating the resources. The other thing that we thought about, and our co-design teams were so instrumental in helping us think through some of these issues, is that we understand that in families, there may be some people that speak the language and some people in the family that might not. For example, people might speak Mandarin and others might not. So what we've done is provided those specific resources in each of the languages, but also have the English equivalent. So for example, if it's Navjot and I reading the Punjabi version, and Navjot reads Punjabi, I do not, I would read the English version of the Punjabi resource, and she and I would be reading the exact same information. So we thought that was really important, that it would mirror the information in the accompanying resource. So both individuals or all members of the family are getting the same information. So when you look at the list, we'll go back, please. When you look at the list of resources on the site, you'll see that they're listed, so the Punjabi version and then the English version for each of the resources. The other couple of things I just wanted to point out is that we also are trying to think about service providers who may be using these resources and sharing them with others. And because there are multiple versions, there could be a little bit, confusing at times. So we've made sure to include a label at the top that indicates the language that the resource is written in, and also the title of the resource. And so this will help individuals that might be giving these resources out to others to help them know which one they wanted to share. And there's also a note about the other language that the resource is available in. And the one other comment I'll make is we also will have French resources. We're just in the process of finalizing those. And so again, those will be coming probably in another month or so. That's going to take us a little bit more time because of the translation we'll need to do. Okay, next slide. The one other thing you might notice is for each community, we've used a different color. That's another way to help distinguish one resource from the other. So here we've used blue for the Italian community, we've used burgundy for the South Asian community, and then we've used red for the Chinese community. Okay. So, I think it's important to acknowledge that there's no one resource that can meet the needs of every individual. So we know that, and there's a lot of amazing resources out there. And, what we want is for people to get as much information as they need to support them and their family. So all of the new resources on the Forward with Dementia website, including these new resources, excuse me, are meant to complement other resources that are available. But the culturally specific resources, they provide that additional cultural specific lens that we think will be helpful. And so now I'm going to turn it back over to Navjot to talk a little bit more about this.
Thank you, Carrie. So I'll just go over how these resources can complement existing information. So the first one is the cultural context enhancement. As Carrie mentioned, these resources have been adapted. So for example, in the South Asian resource, we have a specific resource which addresses stigmas which are prevalent within the South Asian community. So we, when we were during a co-design meetings, we looked like people shared research that they knew about, like for example, the research of UK as well as their own experiences. And we kind of created a list of what are the different stigmas and kind of addressed them. Like it's seen as a normal part of aging. No, it is not a normal part of aging. So, they could relate to those certain stigmas, which they more often than not would have heard within their own community, and then apply that information more effectively. The next one is filling the gap in awareness. So by addressing that cultural nuances, so there might be more generic information that is available out there, but by offering a more comprehensive and inclusive perspective on dementia, such as addressing the stigma piece. We even have a resource on rest for care partners and the importance of self-care for care partners. So really honing in the piece that yes, and I'm going to take a step back and say even like within the Asian culture, there's the concept of filial piety, where it is a belief that, we have our parents stay at home with us as they age, and more often than not, nursing homes and long-term care homes are seen as a taboo and we don't talk about them, and that may not be an end option, but acknowledging with the care partners that yes, we respect those beliefs, but at the same time, it is important to understand about care partner burnout and important to understand the concept of self-care. And even, when we talk about self-care, more often than not, we're able to understand, but taking in that cultural perspective that the term care partner may not even be relevant to them. That's just a duty to them, something they take on without even considering themselves a care partner. So really bringing it in that, this is what care partner means, this is what self-care means, and this is why self-care is important. And then providing a few examples of how they can practice self-care. And again, making those self-care practices very culturally specific to each community. So that's something that can effectively apply rather than just skimming over. Next slide, please. So again, broadening the reach. Again, the representation piece. And when you see, for example, searching, dementia resources for South Asian community or for Chinese community, is going to grasp that attention. And then reading through them, seeing that representation, you can really align with what is being said and implement it. And then next. And then the collaborative approach. So working with the co-design teams and it being complementing other resources, it can really provide this almost holistic understanding of, yes, there's that generic information available out there, but there's also this culturally specific information, and really understanding dementia within more depth could be helpful to address that awareness piece. So the co-design and the impact. So being part of the co-design team, it was really a wonderful experience. Learning from all the different individuals, hearing their experiences and sharing our own stories. At some point, it would almost turn into like a support group where we would share our experiences. But it was like I said, again, it was really the small things that we were able to pick up. And don't use this word. People are not going to relate to it. Or even maintain a good diet for protein, eat. And we saw that most of the options were non-vegetarian. And maybe add in some vegetarian options to how to consume protein, because in many South Asian cultures, majority of the people are vegetarians. So these may not seem like big things, but again, as a person who's reading it, they're able to relate to it. So that was I'm really appreciative of this effort through the RIA and Forward with Dementia to bring this together, because it really captured those small things, and it makes you feel like, you're important and these resources are for you, and as a community, you feel valued. And then, so what were the benefits? So there's the cultural sensitivity piece that we touched upon, that it really honed in on capturing those cultural nuances. There's a tailored approach. So it's not something generic that's been handed out. It is tailored specifically to the community. And the stigma mitigation piece, especially the research, which really, out front talks about, yes, this is a stigma that exists within the community. These are the different types of stigma, and this is how you can address them. So these have been really important, and I feel are a big impact of when it comes to these resources from Forward with Dementia. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yes, thanks very much. And I think we're going to have Dana come on and share any questions. And so, yeah, anyways, we really appreciate everybody joining us today and the attention that you've given, and looking forward to seeing what questions you might have.
Thanks, Carrie, and thank you to both Carrie and Navjot for speaking today, and everyone who's joined the webinar. We appreciate your time. So I'll share some of the questions that were asked throughout the webinar to Carrie and Navjot, and feel free to add any additional questions you have in the Q&A. Let me just pull up questions here. I'll just ask this one first. It was asked in the chat, but I'm not sure if everyone caught the answer. So are the Chinese resources available in Mandarin or Cantonese?
Yeah, so we have the resources available in simplified and traditional Chinese. So so they equate to Cantonese and Mandarin as well. So that is, that's how we've decided to provide those resources.
Thank you. Next question is, whereas the Chinese and Italian are quite specific communities, the South Asian community is very diverse. So why these three bucket choices?
So maybe I'll start, and then Navjot, maybe you want to jump in afterwards. So it's an excellent question. And I think we've acknowledged that from the beginning, that when we say South Asian, it sounds like we're talking about one group, but we are not talking about one group. We chose the South Asian community because looking generally, it is a very large population within Canada. And we see this as a start. This is a start. I think that when we were adapting the information, I think our co-design team was diverse itself. So it wasn't all from one particular South Asian community. So we had some diversity. And the adaptations were such that they weren't prescriptive, like this is the way it is in, the South Asian community. It was talking about more, these are things to consider, and this might be something that individuals that are part of the South Asian community might think about, or might, this is the way they might look at dementia, for example. So I think we've tried to, I think acknowledge and understand that it's not a one size fits all for sure. But again, we see it as a first step. Navjot, obviously you are the expert here, so
No, Carrie, you pretty much captured it all. But yes, so even when we started, and this is something I say often, that when we talk about South Asian community, it's 8 different countries. And even within those countries, there's such diversity. Like, for example, in India, there are over 20 languages that are spoken just within India. So being very mindful of how we are categorizing South Asians. And as Carrie said, our co-design team was very diverse. So we were not just specifically from a certain part of India. We had people from across. And this is just a starting point. So yes, it is in Punjabi, but the English version, we have the English version, which is, again, not just very specific. It was the different perspectives were taken into consideration. And yeah.
yeah. And I think, thank you first, Navjot. I think the point you made too about, even within a community, how there's diversity. And I think that would be true for any community that we're talking about. Even looking at, generational issues, or, how long people have lived in Canada, there can be differences in terms of, how connected in a sense they are to their individual cultures. And so some would be very, very connected and, have the strong ties to that culture. Others maybe that, especially if they've lived in Canada for a longer period of time, those ties may or may not be as strong. And so, I think again, when we were developing the resources, trying to take into account not to be too prescriptive and to be, just giving people food for thought in a sense of the kinds of considerations to think about.
Thank you. And this question is related, but are there other South Asian languages that are being considered for translation? And in follow-up, are there other communities in general that you plan to work with?
So we are really, really hoping to have the resource available in a couple of other South Asian languages. We are just working our budget right now to see if we can have it available or have the resources available in Hindi and Urdu. So please stay tuned. And we would love to continue to do this work with some other communities as well. Like, we've learned so much. It's a lot of work. It's the best work I get to do. So for me, I would love to continue. It is not inexpensive either, especially the translation piece. But it's necessary. So I think we will continue to look for opportunities for funding to see how we can focus on other communities as well. Navjot, I don't know if you have any thoughts you wanted to share.
Oh, I completely agree with you, Carrie. So, and again, resources complement each other. So there are resources out there. So the Sheridan College has a dementia toolkit in Hindi, which talks about how do you communicate with someone living with dementia. They have a very long name, but I think the Alzheimer's Society of Halton, Haldeman, Norfolk. Excuse me if I there are a few of them together, do have, I think, Urdu resources as well, because Urdu is, again, from what I've heard, one of the widely spoken languages within the Halton region. So again, it's about complementing and other resources. So we are at the starting point, but there would be potential other resources for the South Asian communities that are thankfully coming up over the past year that would be available.
Thank you. Okay, the next question I have here is, are there specific cultural considerations that you explored when it comes to legal and ethical aspects of dementia care, such as decision-making and end-of-life choices?
So maybe I'll start, and Navjot, if you want to add anything. Some of that gets tricky, even with the Forward with Dementia website initially, like even in phase 1. Some issues sort of, it doesn't matter where you are in Canada, but other things in terms of legal aspects, as well as, supports and services, are very province specific. And sometimes there can be, in terms of services, variability even within or across a province. So there's a little bit on the website about those issues, but we did have to be a little bit careful because of the differences that are across province. I'm trying to think if we identified anything specifically in the resources that were developed, and there'll be about 15 resources in total for each community. I don't know, Navjot, if you remember anything specific.
Yeah, so I think we, again, Carrie, like you said, even the provincial to province difference, but there's also this really sensitivity, even discussing this amongst the community. So more often than not, we're not open to talking about end of life care, and these resources are supposed to address that. But we also need like a sort of like a starting point to see what research shows. And since there's lack of research even in that area of how certain communities, or for example, South Asian community perceives end of life care, it's a little difficult to gauge how to be sensitive and address that. But there are a few things that we address. So for example, in the care partner resource, we do talk about respite care. So asking for additional help, asking for PSWs or, a day respite, something along those lines, which provides a care partner break. Again, it's not necessarily end of life or the legal aspect, but it is something when it comes to providing care. Every culture has a very specific way of how they see care being provided to their loved ones. So slowly bringing it in. Again, this is starting, so it's going to take some time to open up these conversations and get people comfortable with talking, because even like in my own experience, and I'm pretty sure other people from South Asia in this webinar can agree, like even with my grandma, you don't talk about death and dying, right? Like, oh, don't say that. Like, it's almost like if you say it, it's going to come true. So even now I've been pushing my parents, to talk about advanced care planning, but that's just something we don't talk about. And we completely understand that comes from that lack of awareness, and that needs to be addressed. But it's going to slowly come in one step at a time, especially with such sensitive issues.
Yeah. And I'll just add into, so first, thanks for that, Nav. I think there's similar thoughts when it comes to long-term care as well. And, having, moving a relative into long-term care, and there's a lot of, sensitivities around that. And so it's introduced as, sort of part of the care continuum, and is an issue, or is an option, I should say. And I think we recognize in the resources, based on feedback from our co-design teams, that this is often not something that many communities want to access, but may need to at some point, or may decide to at some point. And so, as Navjot said, it's beginning to introduce some of these ideas and trying to do so in a way that's sensitive to the the understandings and the beliefs in the communities that we worked with.
Yeah, absolutely. This question's more about the resource development itself, but did the RIA review existing resources from other organizations or create their own?
So the information is really based on information from, or the resources are based on information from the Forward with Dementia site. And so that the Forward with Dementia site has some common information to, that you would find elsewhere. But the one thing that is more unique about the Forward with Dementia site, well, there's probably two things. So one is the strong involvement of people living with dementia and family members in the process of developing that resource overall. But the other piece is the aspect of hope. Are the individuals with dementia and the families that we worked with really identified the importance of providing people with a sense of hope. And it's not hope that there's a cure, but it's a hope that people can live with dementia. And so that's something that is incorporated throughout the Forward with Dementia website, and as a result through these resources. And the feedback we've had is that that aspect in particular is something that makes the resource unique. So it's still meant to complement other resources that are out there, but there's some, I think, nuances and aspects that do make it unique at the same time.
Great, thank you. Are there any plans to include Indigenous resources on the RIA website?
That's a great question as well. So when it comes to, and many people are probably already familiar with this, when it comes to working with Indigenous communities, there's some similarity in the processes that you could undertake, but the need for this needs to come from the community. And so it can't really come from us saying, hey, we think you should do this. It really needs to come from the community. And so we haven't had a specific focus on Indigenous communities because we want to make sure that if we do at some point engage with Indigenous communities, that we do so in the right way, in a respectful way, and that's really driven by the communities and not driven by us at the RIA. Now, I'll also say that, as we've been talking about, other resources that are out there. So there are groups such as those led by Dr. Jennifer Walker out of McMaster, where that's the focus is on developing resources for the Indigenous community. So there are groups that are out there that are working directly and hearing directly from communities, and then, and having those communities take the lead. So we'll often point to those individuals and those groups for the excellent work that they are doing. So at this point, we don't have a plan, but again, it's because we want to make sure that we work with Indigenous communities, if we're to do so, in a way that is really driven by them.
Thank you. And this relates to kind of next steps in terms of what's next. And so what do you think are the next steps in closing the gaps in dementia support for diverse communities?
Navjot, do you want to take a shot at that one?
So I think the first and foremost piece is the awareness. I think that's very, very crucial, especially with the lack of translation that's available. Like dementia, again, does not directly translate, at least in South Asian languages, and the lack of awareness and the stigma. Because once we address that, we have people opening up about this conversation, and this conversation starts happening within the community, then only we can see the change happening further down the chain. We can create all these amazing social and recreation programs, that are culturally specific. But if we go to a person's door from a diverse ethno-racial community, knock on the door and say, hey, come join us with this program, they'll be like, nah, sorry, nobody here lives with dementia. Right? So that awareness is the base that we need to do, and we have started. I remember about 3-4 years ago, there was barely anything. I pulled up a video to show to my parents, and it was a voiceover over a couple in England, a European couple, and I remember how thrown off my parents were because it was just translating and none of what they were saying made sense. They were not able to connect to today. We're not just in Canada with the Forward with Dementia and in this and all these other organizations which are bringing out resources. So yes, this is the starting point. The awareness is that we need to address first. And then next steps would be moving on to ensuring that there are the piece, right? Like the engagement piece, the social and cognitive engagement piece, those resources are then adapted and accessible to the community. For example, the activity kits that we have at this point are not culturally relevant. So if you go and pick up an activity kit, it usually includes like a crossword, a word search, and it does not take into context the literacy rate and the cultural and linguistic pieces. Like people may not be able to do a word search or a crossword just because they are not literate in English, right? That's not their language. Or, bingo cards. If I give my grandma a bingo card, she's just gonna look at it and probably use it as a bookmark. She doesn't understand what that is. So yes, starting with awareness and then moving on to other resources that are available out there for care partners and people living with dementia.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. I'll just ask two more questions. The first one is, could you provide some more information about the co-design process, such as the recruitment of people with lived experience?
Yeah, happy to do that. And if anybody online is ever interested in being part of some of the work we do, please let us know. We're always looking for folks. So it took a while to complete some of the recruitment for individuals to be part of our co-design teams. So we put together some materials, posters and little blurbs in social media blurbs and letters that went out to organizations. And we primarily, worked with different organizations that serve diverse communities and asked them to, share information, help identify individuals that might be interested in participating. And it's hard. It's hard to find individuals. It's not that people aren't interested. You just don't always know how to access them, where to find them. They may or may not be connected with services, as Navjot's talking about. If there aren't culturally specific services, then people probably aren't going to be reaching out to them. And so how do you identify individuals? So we really did rely on a number of different community organizations who were amazing and wonderful and really helped us to identify individuals. And the folks that have joined our co-design teams, it's just so much fun to meet with them. As we said, we met with them every month and we got to be really, really close. And as Navjot said, sometimes it was more like, just supporting each other, sharing information, sharing different, experiences or stories and really to feel, I think everybody felt really connected. So that's how the recruitment worked. We've done a lot of co-design. I've done a lot of co-design. So, early on, we want to make sure we are starting those relationships and starting to develop those relationships because that's crucial to be able to have success in a project. People have to be able to feel comfortable to say, Carrie, you don't know what you're talking about, right? Or that's wrong. And that's what I want to hear. I don't want people just to say, yes, or that's good. And if it's not good. So, but in order for people to feel that way, we need a safe space. So we, early on, we talked about expectations and, always made sure to spend time in meetings to just get to know each other and to form those relationships. And, and I think people felt pretty comfortable, as we moved along. So I don't know, Navjot, if you have anything else you want to add about that process.
No, I completely agree, Carrie. Just like that safe space that was created, just sharing stories and tears were shared and laughter was shared. And, just it was never that, oh, I shouldn't share this. Would they understand? Or, that there was never that hesitancy of sharing even the most personal of your stories during this whole care partner journey. And it was such an open space, and everybody was so receptive of your ideas and thoughts, even though we were, even within the South Asian co-design team, all of us were from such diverse backgrounds and spoke different languages. But in that moment, everybody was almost like on the same level. There was no judgment. It was such, like I said, a safe space for us to share. And yes, there were mostly care partners, and like Carrie said, we were not able to bring in people living with dementia, but this is going in the right direction. And hopefully, as people hear about what these safe spaces and these teams, even people living with dementia, would be more open to potentially coming in, because it's understandable. Again, we talked about this throughout the webinar, the lack of awareness and the stigma, but these spaces are crucial to make people feel welcome and come share their stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And on a last note, very quick, are there ways that people can get involved in supporting this work or other research at the Research Institute for Aging?
Of course. So I would say, specific to this project, like, please check out the resources, let other people know about them. We just want the information out there. So everything's freely available. These resources are available in PDF, so you can look online at them, but you can also download them. And, we formatted them in a way to make them nice to look at, we think. So certainly that, I think, would be the first thing, is just to spread the word. And then secondly, feel free to reach out. You can sign up for the RIA newsletter. I think Emma's probably going to put a slide that gives that information. And, we always have different projects that are going on. So if you're interested in learning about what is happening at the RIA, again, feel free to reach out to us. And yeah, and then, maybe there's a project happening that you're interested in getting involved in.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if we do have a slide, but I was going to say we will send an email with our contact information if your question wasn't answered, or if you want to follow up with us. We'll send our contact information and ways to sign up for the newsletter for other opportunities as well. So I'll just pass it over to Emma to give you a few last details.
Thanks so much, Dana. Let me just get my slides back up here. So thank you very much, everyone, for your questions. If your question didn't get answered, please just know that we will record all of the questions asked today, and we'll try our best to address any remaining questions in a later email. You'll also receive a link to view the recording of the webinar as soon as it's available. So we'll send that to you by email as well. If you think of a question after the webinar today, or after checking out the new resources, please email forwardwithdementia@theria.ca. Maybe Dana could put that in the chat for us. And just before closing today's session, I wanted to thank Carrie McAiney and Navjot Gill for their presentation. This was a fantastic introduction to the resources, and Navjot, we appreciate you being willing to share about your personal experience to highlight the importance of this work. I also wanted to acknowledge, I think there are members of our co-design teams online today. So just wanted to say hello and thank you again for all of your help to make these resources what they are. So I'm just going to launch a poll, which should bring some questions onto your screen. We'd really appreciate if you could take a moment to answer those questions and give us feedback on today's webinar. And then the link to the website, forwardwithdementia.ca, is on the screen once again. So we hope you do take some time to check out the resources and to share them with others that might be interested. And we'll continue to add new resources over the next month, as Carrie mentioned, so please check back often. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.